Welcome to the Healthcare Security Cast, the podcast dedicated to healthcare security, safety, and emergency management. If you are involved with a healthcare security program or desire to be, this podcast is for you. Join the conversation as we discuss the issues that matter to healthcare security professionals while leveraging the expertise of healthcare security thought leaders and experts in personal development. And now, here's your host, Brian Hamilton.
Welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Security Cast. Today we're joined by Brian Sallee. Brian, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, Brian. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, pleasure to have you on. And what I always like to do is just kind of start off by learning about the guests that we're speaking with today. So I'll start off by asking, who is Brian Sallee?
All right, great. Thanks. So my name is Brian Sallee. I'm the Director of Security and Emergency Management for Baptist Health System, Kentucky and Indiana. So I work out of the Louisville, Kentucky market, working with a number of hospitals and care sites in our system. So I've been in the industry for, a little over 15 years. Spent a lot of time with IAHSS. Really kind of where I grew up, and was fortunate to be presented with the opportunity here with Baptist Health, and have been here with the organization for going on about three years now. So it was a opportunity to come back home, originally from Kentucky. So that was a nice bonus, if you will.
Awesome. Well, I know I'm very familiar with both IAHSS and Baptist Health. So just thinking in terms of those organizations, is there anybody who sticks out as someone who, really helped you along your way and helped you find your way in this industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we could all point to those folks, and whoever those folks are, and to important to have us realize that, we're giving those folks the kudos and props, if you will. So, some names that come to mind, Phil Nielsen is one, right? Phil Nielsen has been a staple in this industry for years, but Phil is someone that was with HSS when I joined, was one of my first leaders in the industry, and a great counselor and a great guider and educator. Tony York, someone I've worked with for a long time, another individual that has helped me along the way from just a mentoring and guidance standpoint, and Mike Sedzik as well. So Mike and I are good friends, and had the opportunity to work together in a number of different capacities throughout the years, in different settings and different projects. So, and there's, I'm remiss, there's others that I'm sure that I'm not mentioning. So I apologize for that, but those are the folks that I would say that probably stick out, if you will, in the journey that we all find ourselves in.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, I know that there's always those folks, and it's hard to mention everybody, because I think, especially in healthcare security, people are they're so willing to help. So it's hard to remember every single person who made some significant contribution to your career along the way. Absolutely. Right, now, what we'll be discussing today is infant protection, and I'm actually just curious, because you also spoke about this at our annual conference and exhibition in Reno in May. What was it that led to you, really developing the level of knowledge that you have in this subject, and really just, I guess, the general interest that you have in it overall?
Sure. So, I got the opportunity to present some information at the last ACNE in Reno, and really what I would say, Brian, is there's infant security is a very dynamic set of circumstances. So there's a lot of industries, there's a lot of organizations that have put a lot of time and effort into the topic. The most notable one is obviously the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who have been and still are doing a lot of work around this this topic, not just from the standpoint of infant security within healthcare, but just in general, right? They have a very specific focus around healthcare for obvious reasons. So, what I found really during my time in travels, Brian, is that, organizations are very aware of the infant security dynamic. They're aware that there's risk out there, this is organizations of any size and scope, right? This is everything from the 20-bed critical access hospital all the way up to the 700-bed level 1 super mega healthcare campus. Hospital administrators, folks that are working within women's services, their leadership, they're aware that yes, infant security is a risk and is a challenge for the organization and something they need to address. But what I had found in having conversations with administrators, with nursing managers on labor and delivery units, neonatal intensive care units, is that there was really this gap in being able to determine, well, we have a plan, but how are they assessing the plan? There wasn't a lot of thoughtfulness around how do we assess where our gaps are and how do we assess where our opportunities are? Not out of any thing that anyone was doing wrong per se. It was really just kind of this blind spot for a lot of organizations. And a lot of organizations were assessing their plans in different ways, or they weren't assessing them at all. And one of the things I would say is, any organization, whether it is an organization that has 300 births a year in a very small or no neonatal intensive care unit or pediatric unit, all the way up to 4,000 births a year in the inverse of that scope, right, is that they will have some version of an infant security plan. There's some technology piece associated with that. There's some staff training piece associated with that. But if they're not assessing that plan in a thoughtful and consistent way, there are 3 things are not going to happen. So that plan is not, they're not going to find themselves in a place where that plan can be improved, because any one of the plans that we talk about, whether it's workplace violence response or active shooter response, you name the plan, whether it falls into the scope of security or emergency management or both, there's always opportunities for improvement. So if they're not, what I found is that if organizations are not assessing those plans in a consistent and thoughtful way, that plan can't be improved. And risks are not being identified within that plan. So we may have risk and gaps that we're not able to actively identify, and it's not being improved in a way that's thoughtful, right? So we're not identifying risk, we're not improving the plan over time, and which is a problem from the standpoint of being able to proactively get out in front of these kinds of risk and challenges. So, and I'll go back to kind of my lineage. I grew up at a children's hospital, so I spent the better part of a decade at a children's hospital. So I grew up per se in the pediatric infant security world, but the dynamic was that our entire hospital was an infant and pediatric unit. So, you look at it from the standpoint of, most adult acute care hospitals may have one unit or one area that they're securing from an infant security standpoint: NICU, your pediatric unit, labor and delivery. You go to some of your larger children's hospitals, and you're talking about the entire hospital, and it really was kind of looking at it from the vantage point of a very large scope, getting down to a more kind of focused scope, if you will, looking at the issue. So it's just something that I think that is, people can point to it, they know what it is, they know they need to address it, but there's a lot of misconceptions or a lot of opportunity around how those plans are exercised.
Right. So I just kind of want to throw out a hypothetical situation here. Now, let's say you're a healthcare security leader in a new build scenario, or I'll kind of give you 2. Take the one that you want, or even take both. But we have a new build, and we want to establish our infant security program, or you're transitioning to a new healthcare facility, and maybe the infrastructure is in place, but there's maybe not a good plan in place. What would be some of the things that you would recommend for people in those circumstances, just as a kind of a starting point? What's the first thing that they should focus on?
So, yeah, what I would say, I mean, if we're talking about design and development, right? So we're talking about design and development, and really the question becomes, access control is the first piece of that equation. So how our staff and how our visitors accessing the unit, right? So where are elevators located in relation to the into the unit, entrances, exits, those kind of things, stairwells, and realizing that, you know, the life safety, architectural life safety component is something that it is what it is, and we kind of have to massage and work around that. But you know, I would say that the first vantage point to look at in any design and development situation is access control, because that's where the problems are going to arise. How are people getting on and off of the unit? Mainly, how are they getting on the unit? And then how are you screening them and screening and assessing who they are, if you will, in a thoughtful way, so we're able to verify the identity of those folks, and that they're okay to be there, if you will. So access control becomes the first piece, and you know, not necessarily just where doors are and where staff entrances and exits and doors are, but what technology are you using to mitigate access control, right, and to complement your access control standpoint. So whether that's, you know, video, AIP phones, or some type of check-in desk, right, or some other physical mechanism to be able to control access. And ideally, you know, you're looking at it from the standpoint of, do we have the ability to control access farther out? You know, if that unit on the second, third, or fourth floor, some adjacent to floor above, are there opportunities to control access at the outer layers of the building or the organization before they actually are standing in front of a entrance to the unit, where there's opportunities to piggyback, and those kind of things, as far as, you know, defeating or manipulating the access control system. So access control becomes the first piece of that. You know, the next piece of that becomes what technology and what systems do we want to put in place to be able to mitigate and support the access control piece and the infant security piece, right? So there's a couple different legs to that stool, right? So technology is a leg in that stool, policy and procedure is a leg in that stool, and the staff and the people are a leg in that stool. So it's people, processes, and technology. So those three things should really be working together to get us to the ideal outcome that we're looking for. And I think one of the mistakes that are opportunities that are missed for a lot of organizations is that they put a lot of their they put too much emphasis in one specific area. So they say, we're gonna throw all of our eggs into the technology basket, and we're not going to go so much into the people and procedure policy piece, right? So there has to be a nice balance between the two, because, you know, technology is great, and technology is something that is an effective tactic and strategy and tool to mitigate risk, but it's not the only tool, and it's only going to be as effective as the people that are using it, the people that are working within the system, and the same thing's true for your access control policies and procedures and those kind of things, right? So we may say we're going to dump everything in technology, right, and we're going to have the best system, and that's kind of the path we're going to go down. And other organizations will say, well, we're going to go down the people path. We're going to put people everywhere. We're going to have a desk here and a desk there and a desk here and a desk there. It's finding that nice balance of how does the technology, the people, and the processes and the policy, how do they all complement each other? But the first step in that has got to be access control, and then understanding from the access control piece what's possible as far as technology being able to, within the infrastructure, being able to mitigate and support those other tiers in the stool, if you will.
Oh, excellent. Now, I'm going to circle back to for a second to your presentation. One of the things that you mentioned was, you know, again, looking at the effectiveness of the plan that's in place and really kind of addressing, I guess, the root of the problem. Now, one of the things that you mentioned was where these abductions are actually taking place in a healthcare facility. And, you know, what you shared with us is that the majority of these are happening right from the mother's room.
Right. Yeah. So when we go back and you look at some of the data, right? So data should drive decision making, and data should drive our actions to an extent, right? So
right.
The question becomes, how do we as an industry, and how do we as an organization, how do we use data, and how do we use the the elements of the past, if you will, lessons learned, to be able to use those things in our advantage. It's nice to be able to say, 80% of abductions happen from this location, and with this specific event on this specific date and time, the abductor did this and did that. Those are great stories to tell, but it shouldn't just be a story that we tell and people, we kind of say, oh my gosh, that's really interesting. The takeaway and the so what of that is, how do we use those elements and that information to our advantage, tactically, if you will. So if we look at from the standpoint of where the abductions have occurred historically, going back to the data that the National Center has been putting together since I think the mid 60s, of those abductions from healthcare facilities, I believe, I think I'm approximating this number. I think it's like 80% were from the mother's room. So that's a very powerful and interesting statistic. So how do we use that information to be in developing our infant abduction drills and exercises? So what that tells me is that, I should be the abduction happening from the mother's room is a key element that I'm going to build into my scenario for my plan, because the reality of it is 8 times out of 10, that's how it happened. So from a probability standpoint, that's where it would happen. So that's one key piece of it. The other piece of that is looking at stranger-based abductions, right? So there's the breakdown of how many of these abductions are stranger-based abductions versus non-custodial abductions. And I think it's a 70-30 mix, right? 70% of your abductions historically have been stranger-based abductions. So when I develop my scenario, 7 out of 70%, 7 out of the 10 abduction drills that I do should have a stranger-based abduction scenario. The other 30%, the other 3 out of that 10, I need to have some non-custodial element, right? And I think, we all deal with the non-custodial element quite a bit, and it's very visible. Non-custodial, be it, parents have lost custody for whatever reason, jurisdiction has some involvement in child protective services, those kind of things, and those parents abducting that infant after they have their parental rights have been removed. Those situations are I'll say they're no different, but they're similar to these stranger-based abductions, because you have someone that basically has unlawfully removed that infant. They're just their relationship to the infant is different versus the stranger-based abduction, and their motive is different, I guess you could say, is a better way to put that. So, the dynamic is, how are we using that information? Not just to say this is great information, but how are we using those different elements to be able to take that data and that information and drive our decision making in how we formulate these scenarios, who's involved, and how they play out, really from a simulation standpoint. Because one of the things I mentioned, that this is really a simulation. It's a security simulation. Our clinical partners do simulations all the time for clinical care type of scenarios, right? So This situation should really be no different in that that's how we as an organization, and I presented to the other organizations to say, this is not necessarily a drill, this is a simulation. So think about it from your care provider standpoint of presenting to them to say, we're doing an infant abduction simulation, right? Because they can relate to that from the standpoint of, well, we do simulations all the time that are based off clinical care scenarios. We're just expanding the concept a little bit. So you're kind of relating to them on a level that they can get to easier than just saying, we're doing a drill and it's going to happen on this date and time, kind of like a fire drill or a tornado drill and those kind of things. It's kind of interweaving that hybrid version of simulation and drill and exercise together.
Excellent. So yeah, when you talk about the education and training piece, obviously the drills are a big part of that. Now, and I really like that approach as well. Like, looking at the actual real events, 7 out of 10 falling into stranger abductions, and really basing your scenarios on that. That's really, really good thought. Now, the other thing I'm kind of curious about, how often are you conducting these drills? Like, I know when we look at some of the other drills we have to conduct, there are standards around those, and there's not so much in infant protection. So, what do you kind of base that piece on?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and a question a lot of organizations ask, right? They say, well, how often should I be doing these? Should I be doing them monthly? Should I be doing them, annually, or some version of? And, to your point, unlike fire drills, right? Fire drills are a good example where, there's a lot of regulatory guidance to say, thou shall do one fire drill per shift per quarter. And that's kind of universal across the board. And the reason that I would say that is that fire presents a universal risk. Whether I'm a 20-bed critical access hospital in rural Kentucky, pick your location, fire presents the same universal risk to those patients, visitors, and staff as a 800-bed level 1 trauma center in downtown, wherever. So that's an easier solution in my mind to solve for, because a fire is a fire is a fire, and the risk is pretty relative. It's pretty universal across the board. When we think about infant security and infant abductions, right, there are a number of different factors that have got to be considered in how often I'm exercising that plan. And some of those factors are, how many births do you have a year? One, are you a birthing facility at all? So there are many healthcare organizations that are not a traditional birthing facility. So that factor plays into it, right? Does that mean you're totally off the hook and you don't need to do anything? No, because you still have infants that are coming into your facility. They may be treated in an emergency care setting. They may be treated in an outpatient setting. The risk is not zero. It's just less based on the nature of the business and the care that you're providing. So that's really the first piece. The other pieces that you have to look at are how many births do you have a year if you're a birthing facility, right? So are we talking 300 a year, which is about one a day, a little less? Are we talking 3,000 a year, which is a lot, which is 10 times more? So that's one factor in it, right? Because the more births you have, the more infants you're going to have in-house. So too increases the risk, right? So the number of births you have a year, the number, where are you located? What kind of community are you serving, right? Are you in a rural area? Are you in more of an urban area? So that factor plays into it. So those are probably the primary factors to look at when you're determining how often you're exercising that plan. Your staff turnover is another piece of that, right? So from a staff turnover standpoint, do you have a high level of staff turnover because you're a very large unit, you're a teaching facility that has a lot of students and residents that are kind of coming and going on a regular basis? So if your staff turnover is higher, then you're gonna probably want to look at that plan a little bit closely and how you're exercising, because you've got different people that are different faces that are cycling through the organization. So it's really, there's not one set answer to say this many times a year, that many times a year. It's really looking at those different factors, risk factors, and then determining for the organization to say, okay, we're a small hospital, 300 births a year. We're in a rural area. Our staff turnover is very low. So the decision we're going to make as an organization is we're going to exercise our plan twice a year, and it's going to be in quarter one and quarter two, or semi-annual, or some version of. And the other piece of that is, when are you exercising your plan, right? So if you think about that, are you exercising your plan at 2:00 in the afternoon every time you exercise it and you run that drill? How are you including night shift staff, right? So that's the one that we miss. We all like to say, oh, it's convenient for me to do this at 1:00 in the afternoon, right after lunch on a Tuesday afternoon. But being thoughtful about the fact that you've got night shift staff and weekend staff that how are they being included in that process? So a lot of organizations say we're going to exercise our plan 4 times a year, quarterly, and it's going to be on alternating shifts. Q1 is the day shift, Q2 is the night shift, and each shift gets the same amount of visibility to those exercising and learning opportunities, because that's the other part of what it should be, is not just a pass fail, but a learning opportunity, and kind of spreading that equally across the board, being that obviously we're talking about 24/7 operations.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, while we're on the topic of drills, I'm just I just like to kind of pick your brain too on some of the factors that you're considering when you're determining how much is being communicated in advance, whether it's going to be an announced drill, whether it's going to be unannounced, who's going to know what details, and I'm sure, like, again, I won't ask a specific question because it's pretty loaded, but what are some of the things that you consider there?
So it's a good question. So the question really is, and this has come up many times before, right? And I'll use the fire drill analogy in comparison, where we'll have some announced fire drills, some unannounced fire drills. Most of them are unannounced. But the question is, what organizations have to consider is the pros and cons, right? Because there's pros and cons to both. There's pros of doing announced drills. There's cons of doing announced drills. So, if you look at your announced drills, one of the pros of that, several of the pros of that are that you're going to announce it in advance. Staff are going to know. So what does that mean that staff are going to do? So for the most part, what they're going to do is they're going to prepare. So if we say we're going to do a infant abduction drill at 2:00 on Tuesday, then staff, a majority of staff are going to prepare in advance. They're going to go out, they're going to look at the policy and procedure, they're going to understand what their role is and what their role may not be, which is good, which is what we want staff to do from a constant state of readiness all the time. That's just announcing it is the precipitating event that drives them to do that. So that's a great thing. Now, when the con to that, the inverse of that is you fail to assess that constant state of readiness, right? So it's kind of one of those situations where you're not getting full visibility to if this happened, because the actual event obviously is not announced on a Tuesday at 2:00. What's our state of readiness look like? Because all these staff have went and prepared in advance. So that's the trade-off to that, which is something to be considered. But where's the risk reward piece of that? So urgency and realism is something that you lose in an announced drill because people know it's announced. So they will. There's the tendency to kind of not give it the time and attention that it needs because they know it's a drill. Well, I'm really busy and I'm in a meeting and I've got to do this and that. So somebody else will take care of it and they'll respond, which becomes a problem. And then, that leads to engagement declining, right? Because again, they know it's a drill, it's not real. So I'm really busy and I've got to work through this, that, and the other. Now, you think about your announced drills, the staff engagement does the exact opposite, right? It increases. People don't know it's a drill. It's unannounced. We're announcing. We're communicating it as an actual event. So they don't really have visibility to it. That their overall engagement increases, which is a good thing, and which gives you a more accurate state of readiness. So you understand overall, if this event were to occur at any place, any time, any day, here's what our actual state of readiness would look like. And the other part of that is, and this really became evident to me when organizations started to transition to plain language emergency notifications, right? For years we were on the mindset of color-coded language and code red and code pink, and then organizations transitioned and said, hey, let's say what's going on. And it was an aha moment for me when we started making plain language announcements and saying security alert missing infant. People, I mean, they perked up and at a very high level, and there were some emotional stressors tied to that. And I've been doing these kind of drills and exercises for years and years and years. So to me, it was kind of like, okay, well, what's the big deal? We've been saying this forever, but we've not been saying it. But it was like, now we're really saying it now, and people, everybody in the waiting area and parents and visitors, we're saying a missing infant. And it was an aha moment, and it's real. It's very real, and something that's got to be considered. And how you manage that from the staff's emotional standpoint, the patient and visitors' emotional standpoint. What are the talking points for staff to go when if you're a parent that's setting in one of these pediatric units or in labor and delivery or NICU, and all of a sudden you hear announced overhead missing infant, that's a pretty powerful dynamic that's real, and it's got to be managed. So that's the other piece of the unannounced dynamic that's got to be considered. And where I've always said organizations should land is some kind of hybrid model, right? So you don't want to do everything unannounced and everything announced. So you may say, it's 50-50, it's 60-40, but there's some you want to be able to leverage the pros of both dynamics and minimize the cons, and you do that through some kind of hybrid situation.
Excellent. Now, I'm also curious too, while we're talking about drills, one of the things that we touched on was how many of these abductions, obviously they're not a frequent occurrence, but when they do happen, a lot of them tend to be from the mother's room. I'm assuming that's something that you would tie into that scenario as well in many of these cases. They actually have the abduction happen from the mother's room.
Yeah, and it's actually about 60%. So I was a little off my numbers. About 60% of those abductions historically have happened from a healthcare facility, have happened from the mother's room. The other dynamic is, the mother's room is a key. The patient mother's room is a key part of the scenario, right? Because one are actual events where strangers have presented themselves as staff members. They've made their way onto the unit. They've made their way into the mother's room and presented themselves as staff member. Well, that all happened within the mother's room, right? So in the patient's room. The other piece of that is the nursery itself has become an area where really infants don't spend a lot of time in the nursery, where historically the infant spent a lot of time in the nursery and less time in the mother's room. Well, nurseries are now really just kind of outpatient care and screening kind of locations where those kind of small procedures and evaluations and those kind of things happen. For the most part, the infant is spending the majority of their time in the mother's room. That's when we talk about parental education, right? And many organizations, they build into their parental education components around, Mom, you should make sure you do this when you're sleeping. When you're sleeping, call us and we'll take the baby into the nursery, or we'll take the baby somewhere else. When you're you're in the restroom or you're taking a shower, make sure you call us and we'll take the baby to the nursery for you. Making sure that when the infant is in the actual room, that they're on the opposite side of the bed away from the door. So those different parental education components have been built into the overall parental education program, based on the fact that the infant is spending the majority of their time in the infant patient room, mother's room, versus in the nursery. So, that dynamic has really led us to the fact that one, they're spending the majority of their time there. Historical events have told us that when a stranger has presented themselves as a staff member, they've done it in the mother's room. That's where that presentation has happened. I'm a staff member. I'm here to take your baby for A, B, and C. Okay, you look like you belong here. Here you go, and kind of go from there. So that's why those dynamics lead us to the point of the patient's room becoming such a central focus of how that scenario and exercise is built to play out. To include, how are you training your security staff to manage that patient room post abduction, right? So if you built into your plans and your scenarios and procedures dynamics that parent, whoever the patient and parent is removed from the room, that room is secured as a crime scene. Whose role is that? How did the staff play into that? How does security play into that? Because that's essentially a location where a kidnapping has taken place, right? And how are we treating that? And how have we built that into our procedure post-event? And most importantly, how are we training staff to that? And they should be simulating that. We're not actually moving patients, but they should be able to speak to that and simulate and speak to those dynamics as part of that drill and simulation.
No, all valid, all really good points. Now, the other thing too, because you started talking about some of the training elements there, training your security staff. In terms of ongoing training, have you seen or do you participate in, ongoing training where maybe you yourself or some members of your team are working with the staff on these units, in between the drills, for example?
Yeah. So from a training standpoint, let's talk about security first. So what I would say is the kind of new paradigm in my mind around training security staff in response is, where do you want them to respond to? And then what do you want them to do? So depending on the size and scope of your security force, I'll say someone because it might be security and it might be some other component of security, right? Again, if you're talking about small organizations to larger organizations. But from a security standpoint, security should be responding to the unit, right? So that should be responding to the unit. You'll have a procedure in place for how we're accounting for infants. If it's an actual event, what's the post-event response? So there's that training piece of it. The other training piece of that, and this is really a procedural training component, is where do you want your security staff to go? I've seen organizations that say, well, security goes to door A, B, and C. Well, what I would say in looking at a lot of these incidents and events and kind of analyzing them from the outside in, the likelihood that an abductor has, if an abductor has gotten off the unit, and we're then alerted and folks are responding, the likelihood that they are at the front door or out of the building, out of the facility, is very likely. They are more than likely already in the parking garage. They're already walking out of the front door. They've made their way to the outer perimeter of the facility. So conventional thinking tells us if that's the case, and the probability is high that they're going to be out on the perimeter of the facility or in the parking garage and making their way out of the facility, much like a shoplifter does after they lift the product, then that's where I want to push my security resources. I want to push them out to the parking garage. I want to push them out to the parking lot, to the farthest kind of reaches of the campus, to be able to observe and screen, assess how are you managing your parking garages? Are you stopping? Do you have a process set up for stopping vehicles and screening those vehicles? So from a training standpoint, I've always said to organizations, let's take a different, because a lot of organizations, I look at policy and procedures, and again, it's security goes to door A, and radiology goes to door B, and lab goes to door C, and and engineering and facilities goes to door F, which in on the surface sounds, from a training standpoint, very simpler. We all know we work in facilities and we go to door F, but from a practicality standpoint, a lot of people inside these organizations move around all the time, and door F may not be door F anymore. Door F may move or be gone, and now it's something else. So what we've tried to do in training staff and providing guidance to all staff is that when you hear that announcement go off, whatever it may be, code pink, security alert, missing infant, whatever it may be, I want you to go to the nearest entrance or exit. If not including staff, security staff, right? Security staff, we talked about, we want them to go to the farthest reaches of the campus because, one, that's part of their scope, if you will. They're familiar with obviously being in the parking lots and patrolling. But all the other staff, if you will, let's move past the specifics of go to door A, B, C, and D. And I want to give you general guidance and direction to go to regardless of where you are, whether you're in the cafeteria or you're sitting at your desk, I want you to go to the nearest entrance or exit and look for A, B, and C. And if you see A, B, and C, do D, E, and F. And, from a timing standpoint, their staff are getting that training initially upon hire, but they're also drinking from a fire hose of bloodborne pathogens and compliance and this and that and everything else. So there has to be a venue to be able to follow up with all staff where, one, we help them understand that basic component of, regardless of where you are, go to the nearest entrance or exit. Here's what you're looking for. You're looking for A, B, and C. You're looking for suspicious persons with an infant or something large enough to carry an infant, and we want your response to be D, and F. What I have seen over the years is that the majority of staff, from a training and response standpoint, understand what they need to do when they hear the announcement or they get the alert or whatever it may be. They do a very good job of getting up, going to the nearest entrance or exit, and then where the challenge becomes is they don't really understand what they're looking for, and they don't understand, and they're not comfortable in challenging and confronting folks. So they'll either do nothing or they'll totally overreact. So they'll do nothing. If someone's pushing a stroller or carrying a baby out the front door, they'll do nothing, which is bad. Or they'll overreact when someone is walking out with a car seat or bag or whatever, and they'll say, "Hey, I need to stop and talk to you." And that person says, "No, I gotta go. I'm late to do whatever." And then they totally overreact and get into some kind of confrontation that you don't want. So you have to be very thoughtful about giving them actual scenarios through the training process. Ongoing, give them actual scenarios and information of, here's what we want you to do. Here's some talking points. Here's what you're looking for. And here's what your response should be. And that's challenging because, every situation is different. Again, I spent a lot of time in a children's hospital. So it was every day that folks were walking in and out with strollers and car seats and infants and children and everything else. So how do you find that needle in that haystack? So for those kind of organizations, it's even more challenging, right? You think about adult acute care facilities where, there's not as many infants coming through the door. It's a little easier to work through the hay to find that needle. But what I would say is I would encourage organizations to be thoughtful about how they train their staff and what they're looking for and how to confront and challenge, and in a thoughtful way, not hey, you look suspicious, and I bet that baby's not yours, you better sit down, but in the right, in a customer service thoughtful way, right? And it's not easy. I mean, there's a lot of different dynamics that go into that, but when you start to get them thinking down that road, you start them down that road, they'll finish the way for the most part, because they understand what you're trying to convey versus just a kind of going through the motions kind of dynamic.
Right. Okay. And you talked too about some of the things to, kind of what they should be looking for. We know that abductor profiles, there tend to be a lot of similarities when we look at the people who are responsible for these abductions. Now, I know for someone who's, when you're going through the scenario, a lot of those things are going to be hard to identify, but I guess let's talk about what some of those characteristics are in those abductor profiles, and then just maybe whatever it is that staff could be keeping an eye out for in one of these real dynamic situations or in a drill.
Yeah, I mean, your typical abductor profile, right, comes from the National Center. So it's, it's typically female childbearing age. They're typically, they're in a place where they are, many times they could be faking a pregnancy, and they're basically they've convinced spouses and significant others that they're pregnant, and then at some point, obviously, it comes time to deliver on that scenario. That's really your stranger-based abduction. That typical abductor profile is held pretty true to form. So from a staff training standpoint, I think it's important to go to your labor and delivery staff, your NICU staff, your pediatric staff, and help them understand what that profile looks like, and what they should be looking for from the standpoint of if and when someone presents at their unit and starts asking questions and that are unconventional, right? Of oh, I just want to see the babies, and do you allow people to hold the babies, and can we feed the babies, and what time does shift change, and those kinds of reconnaissance kind of questions that are not conventional. You want to be able to train your staff to be able to understand if and when they see that, what they should be doing, right? That they should be contacting security, getting as much information as possible, and what that particular piece looks like. Because when we go back and look at these events, there have been situations where the actual abductors they have done reconnaissance, right? I mean, much like the bank robber does, cases the bank. There's been reconnaissance of how do I get in and out quickly? How do I get in and out of the facility? How do I get in and off the unit? What time are the shift change, right? Where are the stairwells at? Where are the baby? Are there places where they can visibly, view infants from a nursery kind of older school kind of setup, right? That some organizations still do. And then have the staff understand they need to report those things to security, and then security understands what their follow-up would be, and as far as capturing images and video and those kind of things. And expanding out from that, what are you training the staff to look for? What does that look like? The first piece is, again, the general traveling staff. You're training them on 3 different things to look for when they're responding to these situations. So what I've ran into a lot of times is that you'll have staff that'll say they won't let anybody leave. So they're basically saying, oh, we're locked down, you can't leave, and that's it. Well, that's not necessarily true to form what you're looking for. You want to be able to train staff to that they're looking for in response someone who has an infant in their possession or is carrying an item large enough to conceal an infant. If you have just the normal if I'm just walking out the front door and I don't have an infant on my person, and I clearly don't, and I'm not pushing a car seat or a stroller, and I don't have an item large enough to conceal an infant, it's a pretty good guess that I don't have an infant. So I don't fall into that suspicious person category, right? So you can let me go. And so you can if they don't have an infant, they're not in possession of an infant, they don't have a large item large enough to conceal, don't worry about them. You've screened them, if you will, send them on their way. If there's someone that's carrying an infant, they're pushing a car stroller, they're not attempting to conceal that infant, they're just kind of, it's, I'm just going about my daily business, then you're training and directing them to stop that person, have some talking points, being polite, right? Excuse me, there's an emergency situation right now. Where are you folks coming from? Did you have an appointment today? That kind of thing. Oh yeah, we had an appointment, and here's our discharge paperwork. And okay, great, thank you. Going about your way. And if the person says, is belligerent and refuses to talk to the person or comply in any way, well, they just got on the radar, and that's someone then their response should be that, okay, you're following that person at a safe distance, right? The last thing you want to do is get into a physical confrontation. You're calling security, you're getting a description, a direction of travel. Oh, they got into a vehicle. I took a picture of the license plate. All, being a good witness. Because if you're not training that and setting that expectation, then what happens is, again, they'll either do nothing or they'll overreact. And I've seen staff members who have said, nope, you and this baby are not in a simulated scenario, you're not leaving. And they basically, threw the elbow to them and said, it's either, if you want to leave, you're coming over me or through me, which is not what we want them to do. The third scenario is if they have an item large enough to conceal an infant. There have been several scenarios where the abductor did just that. They concealed that infant in a bag, in an item that was large enough to conceal that infant, large purse, backpack, that kind of thing. So, we want them to spot those items, stop that person. It's the same polite, excuse me, ma'am, sir, there's an emergency, could I take a look in your bag, those kind of things. And the problem is those are not natural conversations to have. It's not a natural conversation to say, excuse me, ma'am, for me to say, excuse me, ma'am, or sir, or anybody, hey, can you open up your bag so I can take a look at what's in there? I mean, if we were talking about going through the airport and TSA, that'd be a natural conversation. It's not a natural conversation. I'm just walking out of the hospital and somebody in scrub says, hey, I want to look in your bag and I want to talk to you about you and your baby. They're just, and that's what that uncomfortable, that unnatural conversation piece is what we have to get staff over to say, hey, it's going to be an unnatural conversation. It's not going to be a free-flowing conversation, but you have to be able to guide and direct it. And here's how, and help them understand. There have been situations and abductions, actual abductions, that have been thwarted just because of those types of conversations and how the staff have approached it. But that's the challenge and the hill that we have to try to get over.
No, absolutely. All right. So we've covered quite a bit here just on this topic. Is there anything else that you wanted to add that I didn't ask you about that you probably were expecting me to?
No, not per se. I mean, I think my recommendation and my takeaway to any of this would be, as healthcare security practitioners, we're looking at a number of different risks through a number of different lenses, right? And some garner more attention than others. Workplace violence is a huge dynamic and a huge area for everyone who is practicing within the industry, for obvious reasons. But what I would encourage everybody is to not necessarily lose sight of all these other risks, but to take a step back and understand inside of your organization or your organizations, plural, what's in place now, and where is the state of our be it the security practitioners working relationship with our women's services folks and our education folks to be able to put together a thoughtful, proactive program that addresses these different dynamics. Again, how do we train staff to be able to have that level of visibility and the level of emphasis that we want them to have on it? And folks that have been working through and training fire response, right? We've been doing that for years, and it's the same challenges, right? We're trying to get everybody to understand, here's how you respond to those kind of circumstances. It's the same kind of playbook, but just in a little different dynamic. So there's there's, I'm sure, opportunities in every organization to have those types of thoughtful, proactive discussions starting with your infant care units, your labor and delivery, your NICU, your postpartum units, to have that thoughtful discussion to say, hey, we want to partner with you to put this program together. It's not necessarily you need to do this and you need to do that and you need to do this. It's, we're in this together. So how do we put together, emphasis be on we, how do we collaborate to put together a proactive, thoughtful program that we can assess that allows us to do everything that we want to do? And then how do you publicize that, right? I mean, how do you, I think a lot of times some organizations will say, well, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind is better, right? When we think about infant security, because the last thing a parent or family would want to have happen or have visibility to is an abduction. I mean, what a horrible set of circumstances, and it's all in how you present it, right? And if you present it from the standpoint of in a negative, unproductive kind of taboo kind of way, that's how it's going to be perceived by people, as opposed to saying, hey, we're on the cutting edge of this. We're an organization that is doing all of these great things proactively because we understand the risk, and we're way out in front of it. I mean, I think there's much more mileage to gain from that than just saying, well, we have to do this, and okay, here we go, check a block and move on.
Absolutely. It's always more difficult to get buy-in to take a proactive approach in a lot of these scenarios. But no, if you can definitely do that, it is the way to go. Being prepared.
Yeah, I'll give you a really quick example. I worked in an organization where we had, when I was at a children's hospital, we were not an organization that subscribed to having an infant protection system. Infants were not born inside this organization per se in a traditional labor and delivery unit. There was a NICU and those kind of areas. And as a general rule, from an abduction standpoint, you can say that as acuity increases, mobility decreases, as does the risk of abduction. So when you think about a NICU, acuity is typically high, staff to patient ratios are high, mobility is low, your risk of abduction is lower, not zero. You think about labor and delivery units, well babies that are not inside of a NICU, the acuity is typically lower, mobility is higher, staff to patient ratios may be lower, risk of abduction increases. So, we had found ourselves in a place where we had partnered with an academic center and a maternal fetal medicine program. We found ourselves in a place where we were now going to have a unit where infants were born. And some of those infants would stay on the actual unit. So, but most would go to a NICU, right? But you may have times when there's one or two infants that are staying in traditional labor and delivery in mom's room, not in the NICU. And how do we manage that risk? Do we invest in a very large, from a cost standpoint and a resource standpoint, do we invest in an infant protection system, realizing that we're talking about maybe one or two infants every couple months kind of thing, right? Where we got to was the point to a point where, well, again, let's look at the data, let's look at the historical events and have that drive what we do. And we ended up going with this kind of hoteling concept of infant security that really started in a few healthcare facilities, I believe in the Dakotas, but was an interesting concept that we kind of took and ran with to say, okay, well, if we know that 50+% of the abductions happen from the mother's room, and we don't do a good job of an industry of keeping the abductors off the unit because of piggybacking and other things, the mother's room is what we're trying to secure, then let's secure the room. And let's go with this hoteling concept to say that, we have a room that has a badge reader on it. It's secured just like your hotel rooms. And as people go in and out of that room, just like a hotel room, they're issued, mom and significant other are issued a badge, just like when you check into the hotel, you got 2 keys and they go in and out and the staff have the same level of access. And it was interesting when we presented that concept, there were a lot of folks that said, oh my gosh, staff are going to hate it. Patients are going to hate it. They're going to feel like you're locking them in their room. It's going to be horrible. And, we were able to put together a situation, a case, and present that to patients to say, this is how we're managing the security of your infant. This is a, you know, kind of a new concept, and it's just like a hotel, and it's for your security, your infant security, and folks loved it, and they were all about it, right? And I used to tell people when I would, you know, kind of show them this setup from a demo, because they were like, wow, you have patient rooms that lock, and they're not like, you know, behavioral. Yeah, they're regular, they lock right there. There it is, you know. And it was like, well, that's strange. That's okay. Well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever stayed in a hotel? Oh yeah, I stayed in a hotel. Okay, well, did your hotel room lock? You know, oh yeah, of course it locked. You know, I wouldn't stay in a hotel that didn't lock. Oh, okay. All right. Well, you ever been in the hospital, you know, as a patient? You know, well, yeah, okay. Did your room lock? You know, no. People had to come in and out all the time, you know, and you were okay with that. Well, yeah, I mean, that's just how it is. Okay, well, you know, we're just taking a different approach to a risk, to the same risk. We're just looking at it from a different way, if you will. But it was a success. I mean, it worked out very well, but allowed us to take kind of an unconventional approach to a conventional problem. So, you know, what I would say to folks is, you know, the limits are your imagination of how you structure your programs and tactics and those kind of things to be able to manage these risks. But, you know, there's a lot of work that goes into it. Find yourself in a position to tell a story that is positive and you know, and helps others, patients, visitors, staff understand, here's what we're doing, and we're way out in front of this, versus, you know, we're not going to pay attention to or look at it and just kind of hide it over here, kind of thing.
Definitely excellent advice. And yeah, I was hoping we would get around to that part, but no, it's an interesting concept. Is, like you said, a kind of an unconventional method to secure those rooms, you know, just based on what we know, but it's technology that's there readily available. So yeah, why not make use of it?
Absolutely.
Now, just with regards to yourself, what are the best ways for us to connect with you? Is there anything also that maybe you're working on that we should be on the lookout for?
The best way to connect with me is probably through email. So it's actually Robert, ROBERT Sallee, SALLEE at B as in boy, H as in Henry, Sam as in Sam, I as in Indiana.com, BHSI.com. You know, right now, Brian, not necessarily. We're really. I'm finding myself within the organization. We have a lot of different strategic projects that are happening here in the Kentuckiana region. So a lot of emphasis on emergency management, right? Just on how the new standards and things that are changing. But nothing in particular. I think there's definitely some opportunities and to have some further discussions around this concept and how we pair that with workplace violence, right? So workplace violence is kind of taken center stage in a lot of ways, and you know, how do we expand this concept outside of the stranger-based abductions to help organizations understand how are they managing non-custodial parental situations, right? And where an element of violence is possible, right? You have these folks that are inside your organization who are parents, who are the biological parents, right? We're delivering news to them that, oh, by the way, the baby that you thought you were going home with is not, that's not the case. The propensity for violence associated with that. How do we use what we've already been working through the workplace violence response to be able to pair around that non-custodial parental dynamic, and really helping organizations to understand how to proactively get out in front of those. What are the strategies? What are the scenarios? What do they need to be guidelines around how to manage those non-custodial parental situations most effectively? And many organizations already do this, and they do it very well, but it's still an element of workplace violence, infant security. They kind of cross paths, so to speak. So how do we pair those two together to help your social services, social work staff in the hospitals, security, neonatal intensive care staff, postpartum, labor and delivery, women's services staff, right? Understand how to educate and help them understand how to navigate those situations, and then partner with security to be able to come up with these plans proactively. It's all about proactive planning, right? Because, you know, if we can get out in front of these kind of scenarios, then, you know, that's 3/4 or not more of the battle. And a lot of organizations, when they don't have that level of proactive planning, that's when things go awry, and we're kind of trying to pick up the pieces. So, I think there's some work to be done in that arena as we think about this. When we think about this topic.
I agree. Yeah, no, definitely lots more conversations to be had. So, Brian, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us. Again, just thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you, and appreciate you doing this. It's a great project, and enjoy the conversations. This conversation, enjoy the other conversations with other folks that you've had. So I appreciate that very much.